Hey, it's Silver, and this is Theseus Protocol. Now, I've said multiple times in the past that when it comes to the deck builder genre, it's very, very crowded. There's a lot of them to choose from now, so you've got to do something to stand out. And that's actually what initially attracted my attention to this game in particular, because some of the stuff that it's actually doing in an attempt to stand out is actually pretty interesting in my opinion. But one of the big ones is that I believe this game represents a sort of step forward for the whole genre in terms of its presentation. One of the most common criticisms of the genre is that it's kinda slow. And while some people like me are very much used to turn-based games and don't necessarily mind that, it is also oftentimes true. The games can be relatively slow-paced. And this game is presenting itself in this really slick cyberpunk style that adds a lot both to its aesthetics but also to its interface and how responsive it is. The card playing and the choice making and all that stuff is actually done in this really snappy, precise-feeling way that's really fast. And it makes the turns go by a lot faster as well. So I think that this game's overall presentation style, from its aesthetic appearance in general, but also its interface and all of its menus and things, are all a good step forward. And honestly, this is the sort of style that I would like for games in this genre to take from this point forward. Not necessarily Cyberpunk, but I just mean in terms of its overall responsiveness and how snappy the controls feel, I think is a really good step. And I think a lot of its other features, the things that it's doing differently, are all kind of in service to this idea that it's meant to be a more fast-paced, snappy experience, and I think it all comes together to make a really smooth, slick game so far that does definitely need some work in its early access campaign. There are some things to be discussed about that later, but I do think what's currently here is very promising. So, how does it work? Well, the overall structure will be familiar to you if you've played one of these games before. First of all, you choose a character, and each character has two different weapons that they can start with, which is very unusual, but we'll get onto that in a minute once we get to the combat part. And once you choose your character, you will simply be presented with a straight line of areas, which is unusual because most of the time in these games you get a sort of grid of different areas to pick from, usually 2 or 3 at a time. But in this case, there's only a straight line. However, each node is actually 4 different choices that you make. Usually, each of the 4 choices is the same basic thing, but they have different rewards. So you're meant to take a peek at the preview of the rewards, choose which one you think has the best one for you at the time, and then choose that one. So that means on each step of the journey you will have 4 choices per node. One difference to the general formula for these games that you'll immediately notice is that you don't get one card as a reward when you complete a battle. Usually that's how it works. After every battle you get a choice between a couple of different cards and you choose one of them. But in this game you actually get a choice between 3 different sets of 3 cards each. But only one of the cards in each of those 3 sets will be visible before you actually complete the battle. So effectively 6 of those cards are all going to be a mystery to you, and you're meant to choose between the 4 different battles available to you by the one reward that you want the most, and then the other ones will sort of reveal themselves after the battle and could change your choice depending on exactly what sort of build you're playing. Now, combat is, of course, turn-based, and it is using an action point-based system where you generally start with 3 action points as each character, and every card will have an action point cost in the top left corner that it will take to play. And your hand size is generally relatively small at first in this game, but as far as I can tell, there isn't like an upper limit on it, which means it can actually get sort of ridiculous if you get a whole bunch of card draw effects at once. You can have a massive hand, although at the end of the turn you do discard your entire hand, and it uses the same sort of draw/discard pile mechanic that these games tend to use. But you also have an exiled card pile, a sort of place where cards can go that do not get redrawn in the next step, so they stay here until the end of battle. And this is where that weapon system I mentioned earlier comes into play, because each character is equipped with 2 different weapons. You can switch between them at any time as a free action. It doesn't take a turn or any AP to do so, but each weapon has a charge, represented by those lightning bolts in the bottom left of the screen. And in order to charge up a weapon, you have to hold right-click on a card to actually burn it for charge, and the amount of charge that each card gives will be in the top right of the card itself. So this means that you don't actually necessarily want to play every card that's in your hand. Some of them you want to discard in order to fuel your weapon. And once your weapon is full on charge, of course, you can fire it. And every weapon has a different amount of charge that it needs, as well as a different amount of damage it does, different special effects, and a cooldown, because after it is fired, it will go on cooldown for a few turns, and you won't be able to burn any cards for it, so you have to switch to your other weapon, thus encouraging you to use both of them. However, whenever you burn a card for weapon charge, it is not discarded, it is exiled. So you will not draw that card again for the rest of the combat, which means you have to be pretty careful about which cards you actually want to use as fuel for your weapon, because, if you burn all of your defensive cards, then you won't have any way to defend yourself. You won't have any shield cards left until the end of the battle. So you do have to actually be really careful about what you burn and what you play, and this makes this game the only deck builder I can think of where you actually want cards in your deck that you don't intend to play. Because in most deck builders, the idea is to build the most efficient deck possible for the build that you're going for, right? You want to remove cards you don't need, trim the fat, you want only a very small number of things, that way you have a very high chance of drawing what you need at that time, because the deck is composed of a very few things that are all useful to you. But in this game, you actually don't always want that, because if you have very few cards, then you won't really be able to burn any for your weapon charge, because you'll need to play all of them for your build. So you actually want some extra fat along the sides of your build so that you can actually have cards that you're okay with burning in order to power your weapons. And you definitely do want to power them because they are quite powerful. They don't take any AP to use. They're a free action, so they represent a lot of extra damage that you can do that isn't bound to your action points. And also you can overcharge weapons. You have to do this by making sure the last card you burn is more than is required to fuel it to completion. So if it has 1 lightning bolt left and you burn a card worth 2, it'll overcharge it. But if it's already fully charged, you can't burn more to overcharge it on purpose. And an overcharged weapon will have a pretty significant damage increase to its shot, as well as a different animation that looks really cool, and oftentimes they have some sort of special effect. It might change the way that their damage is applied between enemy shields and armor, or it might even apply some extra debuffs like burn and some stuff like that. So it's worth overcharging if you can, but of course that does mean you are burning a more valuable card than you technically need to fire the weapon. So again, it's all about tactical choice here. And there are also some cards that actually have a special feature that if you burn them, they actually do something as if you played them, kind of. So there are various bullet cards, for instance, that actually cannot be played. You have to burn them, and they give you charge for your weapon and do something else depending on the type of bullet, like give you extra shield or something like that. And there are also a couple of extra utility cards you can find that are really nice to have that give things like shield or buffs like Valiance, which is a big damage increase and stuff like that when you burn them, as well as having an effect that makes them playable, so that you can have a more flexible hand where, maybe you want to burn it, maybe you want to play it. It depends on the situation that you're in. It's good to have a good number of cards like that so that you have a more flexible deck that can adapt to different situations. In addition to the battles, you've also got some of the other mainstays of the deck builder genre, like elite battles with much harder enemies. You've also, of course, got boss battles at the very end that tend to be really difficult, by the way, in multi-phase, but are really fun to do because they have some really cool visual designs and a lot of different attacks and things to learn, which is something I really like in turn-based games like this. But you've also got your multiple-choice adventure segments that are often common in games like this, where you get a big paragraph of like lore and dialogue and stuff, and then you choose a different multiple-choice sort of resolution for that quest and get a benefit. Now, this is one aspect of the game that could use a little bit of work, because oftentimes either the benefits are not known to you until you choose them for the first time and you sort of memorize what each one does, or the game actually displays the consequences for each action next to the choice so that you know what's about to happen. This game sort of does both, and it doesn't make any sense. So some choices will be blank and you'll just have to pick it and see what happens, while other choices will actually just straight up tell you right next to it what it's going to do. And it doesn't really make any sense to use both of those. I feel like you should either go full mystery or full transparency. I just don't think there's really much of a benefit to sort of only displaying half of them and then the other half being a mystery. It's a bit odd as far as choices go, although there aren't very many of these multiple choice quest events in the game right now, so they're not a huge part of your overall build, but they do help. There are currently 2 characters playable in the early access version. There's also a third one that is going to be added later down the line, and to the game's credit, they both play very differently from each other. The second character, for instance, has a completely different sort of buff that's always active on her. It's a mood buff, and it fluctuates depending on what cards you're playing. And you can actually alter her mood by playing different cards, and they will give you different benefits or debuffs depending on how the mood falls. So it actually makes her a lot harder to play because you have to manage this resource in addition to also trying to stay alive. And she also can summon various things to help her out, which is pretty cool. And her secondary weapon, rather than just being a weapon that you switch to, is actually a form change that actually transforms her into like a different character entirely. She has these blue and red cards that offer a choice, and those cards transform into something completely different when she's in this form, and she becomes a lot more aggressive and gets a lot of attack-focused stuff. So she's actually a really interesting character to play, and because of how different she is from the more traditional sort of jack-of-all-trades first character, it makes me excited for what the third character is going to be like, because they obviously have some really good ideas for how to make these characters play vastly differently from each other, so I think that's a definite point in the game's favor. As far as the early access goes, what are some things that need worked on or some things that I would like to see? One of them is the translation. Now, I'm not saying the translation is bad because it's actually quite good. All of the card text and artifact text and all that stuff is very well translated and it makes perfect sense. Now, the problem isn't that it's bad, it's that it's just sort of incomplete. There are some areas of the game that just aren't translated yet. All of the flavor text for your artifacts, for instance, are not translated. Some of the multiple choice things in the adventure segments, they're also not translated, and a couple of the weapon menu things are not translated either. So for the most part, the game is very well translated, but there are some spots where they obviously still need to do a couple of things, especially in terms of flavor text and the like. Now, your main method of meta progression is actually weapon upgrades, which is interesting. It's not card upgrades. And you can get various chips and passives for each of the character's weapons that you can get with this meta currency you earn for completing runs, whether you win or lose. And you can use these chips to go down to sort of a skill tree-like setup for each weapon in order to strengthen them and add new capabilities to them and stuff. But the side effect of this is that there is no card upgrade system in the game, which is pretty standard for one of these games. Usually there's a way to upgrade cards, give them a plus or something next to their name, and improves their capacity somewhat. That doesn't happen in this game, which means all cards are always the same strength, which isn't necessarily a problem if you balance your game around that, but the side effect that has is that normally when in these games when you get to a camp or whatever the healing node is, you have a choice between healing yourself or upgrading a card, and that choice is there to reward players that are playing very well that don't need the healing with something else to do at this node, so it's not a wasted node, so that they can actually use the heal they don't need instead to upgrade something. But since this game doesn't have a card upgrade system, that means there's no other choice at healing nodes, which means if you get to one, you have to heal no matter what, even if you don't need it. So it would be nice to have something else in healing nodes to be able to do aside from healing. That way, if you're playing very well and you don't need the heal, you can take some other option that makes that node still useful. Another thing that I would like to see, personally, are a lot more character-specific cards. There are some, but I feel like there aren't enough. I think there could definitely be a lot more character-unique cards, especially as rewards for elite and boss kills. Because right now, killing an elite enemy and killing a boss enemy, they give you pretty much the same pool of card rewards as any other battle. And I think it would be better to have some high-rarity, character-specific, unique stuff that appeared, if you were able to beat those enemies, to give them more of an impact. I would also like to see a bit more of a balancing pass done, especially in terms of the artifacts, because the artifacts in this game range from almost useless to absurdly overpowered, and there are some that are just flat out better than others, which is usually the opposite of what this genre wants, right? You're supposed to have artifacts that are very good for certain builds and not for others, and they're all kind of side grades to each other depending on what sort of character you're playing at that time. But in this game, there are some artifacts that are just not very good and others that are just flat out better versions of them that you would never not want to take. Like, for instance, there's an artifact that gives you an extra AP to spend after you play 8 different defense cards in a row, which is pretty useful. But then there's another artifact that gives you 15 extra maximum health and an extra AP to spend at the beginning of every single turn for free, which is just flat out better than the other one. It's something that you would never not want to have as soon as you have the option to get it. So I think there's definitely some work to be done in terms of game balance, because there are some things that are just better than other things, and that is usually the opposite of how the balance of this genre is meant to work, with everything being a side grade, very build dependent in general. So aside from those small issues, I think this game is actually shaping up to be really interesting, and I think it's definitely something that you should take a look at if you're a fan of deck builders like me. It is definitely a push forward in terms of presentation and the snappiness of control. I really like the aesthetic and the art. I think all of the artwork is really well done. The animations are nice, although I would like to see more unique animations for player attacks, because all of the enemies have unique animations for all of their moves, but you don't currently have unique animations for most of your skills and stuff, so I would like to see more of those added to add more flair to the combat and characters. So I think this should be a very well-utilized early access campaign. I think during its time it'll finish with the translation, it'll add the third character, and it will polish up the bits that need some attention, because they seem pretty serious about their product so far. It's just very well presented and very, very slick and fresh and nice, so I have a feeling that it'll be quite good down the line when some of the extra polish gets added on top of all that. So the link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page. You can check it out and grab it yourself tomorrow, the 17th, at the time that this video goes up. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.